At the time of purchasing the goods, you should be aware of who is the actual owner of the product at present, whether the manufacturer or the seller. If it is an ordinary course of business, then easily you can buy the products without any hesitations or confusions. At that time, this rule is not applicable. Two parties came into a contract, but one party failed to fulfill the conditions of the contract, then it become voidable contract. Hello everyone, I am Arun Kumar, lecturer in Department of Commerce and Management, Vidhyaashram First Grade College, the Temple of Excellence, MYSURU. Dear students, welcome to this new session on unit number 2, that is the Sale of Goods Act 1930. So this is session 3 on this particular unit. So you all know what and all we discussed in the last previous 2 sessions with relating to chapter number 2. And in this particular session, we are going to discuss few more topics with respect to the Sale of Goods Act 1930. So whenever you are answering to a question, it is very important to write down the act. In case if you are answering few questions with respect to Contract Act, so the Contract Act 1872, you're supposed to mention the act and from which year it came into existence. In the same way, with respect to the Sale of Goods Act, while you're answering the questions, it is very important to mention that in which year that particular act came into existence or came into force. So why you are supposed to write this? Because if you write the act and in which year it came into force, so that you can score more marks. So the evaluator of the papers, okay, the evaluator of the paper will get to know that you have a content. You have the content and they will be giving you the more marks in your exams. So while you're writing the answers with respect to the Sale of Goods Act, so write the year of enforcement also, that is 1930. So yes, dear students, in this session, we'll be discussing few more topics with respect to the Sale of Goods Act 1930. So sale by non-owners. Yes, if you are the owner of the product, then easily you can sell the product to anyone else, right? So you can sell it to anyone if you are the real owner of the product. If you are not the real owner of the product also, you can sell the products with certain conditions, right? So you are the owner, okay, you are the actual owner of that particular product. You can sell the product to anyone. So without taking any permission from anybody. But if you are not the owner of the property or the goods, then you can sell the product or can sell the property, but only with certain conditions. Okay, so about this we are going to learn now. So sale by non-owners. The general rules is that if a person who has no right or title to the goods sold the same, the buyer cannot obtain any right or title of the goods which he purchased, even though he may have acted honestly and paid the value for the goods. Yes, what the sentence says, what the statement says. The statement says that if you are not the owner of the goods, then you will not be, having the right on the goods, or you are not entitled as the owner of the goods. In the same way, the buyer will not be getting the ownership even though he paid the proper value for the goods. So that is what the statement says. So if you are the owner, you will be having all the rights. You are entitled the ownership, so you can transfer it to anyone else. If you are not the owner of the goods, then you will not be having the right. You are not the real owner of the product or the goods, and the buyer of the goods is also will not be transferring the ownership to his name, even though he is paying the actual cost or the fair value for the goods. Thus, a buyer cannot get goods title to the goods unless he purchases the goods from a person who gives the owner thereof or who sells them under the authority or with the consent of the owner. Yes, the particular buyer who is purchasing the product, the person who is purchasing the product will not get the ownership until the real owner gives the consent about selling the product or transferring the ownership of the product from him to the buyer. Here you can see the consent of the owner. Yes, the consent of the real owner of the goods or the property is supposed to give the permission to sell that by third party. So if third party gets the permission from the real owner of the goods so that he can sell it to the the receiver or to the buyer, then the buyer will be getting the good as well as the ownership of that particular goods. This is based on the following important Latin maxim. This is based on the Latin maxim. So what it says, nemo dat quod non habet. Nemo dat quod non habet. So which means no one can give what he has not got. Yes. So what it says, the Latin word, no one can give not what he has not got. Right. So if you're not received yet, how can you give it to someone else? If you're not received the ownership, how can you give it to someone else? Right. So if you get the ownership, so that easily you can transfer it to someone else. Okay. So you are the second party, the third party is the buyer, the first party is someone else, the person who manufactured the product. Okay. So as a middleman, just you're acting between the buyer and the seller. So the seller is the real owner at present and the buyer yet to receive the goods. So once if the seller transfers the ownership to you, to the middleman, to the dealer, then easily you can transfer the ownership to the to the buyer, right? So if buyer is not having any idea about the ownership, who is the owner of the product and all, then he will be in a trouble. So at the time of purchasing the goods, you should be aware of who is the actual owner of the product at present, whether the manufacturer or the seller. So the Latin word says, that is the nemo dat quod non habet, which means no one can give what he has not got. So you can't give if you are not received yet. How can you give it to someone else? You received it, but the ownership is not yet transferred. So until the ownership transferred to you, how can you give it to someone else? How can you transfer the ownership to someone else? So section 27 of the Sale of Goods Act also provided that where goods are sold by a person who is not the owner thereof and who does not sell them under the authority or with the consent of the owner, the buyer acquires no better title to the goods than the seller had. Yes, here if the seller of the goods, according to section 27 of the Sale of Goods Act 1930, Sale of Goods Act also provided that where goods are sold by a person, the goods sold by a person who is not the owner thereof. If he is not the owner of the product, and if he sells the goods and who does not sell them under the authority or with the consent of the owner. That means if any person is not the owner and if he is selling that goods, the same goods, without taking the consent of the the seller or without any authority, having any authority on the goods, the buyer acquires no better title to the goods than the seller. If a seller selling the goods without taking the consent of the actual seller or the actual owner of the goods, then the buyer will not acquire any kind of authority or the ownership on the goods. That is what section 27 of the Sale of Goods Act 1930 says. So moving further, expectations to the rule nemo dat quod non habet. So we already got to know what does it mean. Nemo dat quod non habet. That means if you are not received it, how can you give it to someone else? If you don't have the ownership, how can you transfer it to someone else? That is the actual meaning. This is a Latin word. If you want to know the meaning in English, Yes, if you don't have the ownership, how can you transfer to someone else? Okay, so the expectations with respect to this rule. Title by estoppels, that is section 27. When the owner of goods, by his conduct or by statement willfully leads the buyer to the belief that the seller has the authority to sell, then is stopped, that is prevented from denying the seller authority to sell. That means here section 27 explains that title by estoppels, that means when the owner of the goods by his conduct or by statement willfully leads the buyer to believe that, in case if the seller or if the real owner of the product, if he try to convince by his conduct or by statement to the buyer to buy the product, okay, then is stopped from denying the seller's authority to sell. Yes, that means best example. Okay, so there are three parties. One is the middleman, one is the seller, another is the buyer. Okay, so what this middleman will do? The middleman ask the seller to give the consent to sell the product. When the buyer is in front of the seller, what middleman will do? The middleman will do, sir, give me the consent to sell the product. So what the seller will do? Seller give the consent to sell the product. So buyer easily can buy the product because he had given the consent. Okay. In this scenario, we can sell the product to anyone else. That is what section 27 of the Sale of Goods Act says. Sale by mercantile agent. That is section 27 subsection 2. This exception will apply if the following conditions are satisfied. That is, the goods must have been sold by a mercantile agent. Yes, if the goods are sold by a mercantile agent, then you need not to ask for the permission or the consent of the owner of the goods. Easily you can purchase. So at that point of time, this rule is not applicable. Next, he must be in the possession of the goods or any document of title of the goods with the consent of the real owner. Yes, if any seller is in the consent of the owner with some documents with respect to the goods, okay, if he is in the possession of the goods and if he is having any document with respect to the goods with the consent of the owner, then easily he can sell that goods to the buyer, and at that time this condition is again not applicable. Next, the sale should be in the ordinary course of business. Yes, if the sales is in the ordinary course of business, for example, you go and buy a shampoo. Okay, you go to a shopping mall or you go to a store, provision store or somewhere. So what you'll do, just you purchase a shampoo by paying 100 rupees. So you need not to ask that shopkeeper about whether he is the owner, whether he transferred the ownership to his name or not, or he is supposed to take the consent of the actual owner of the shampoo company. No. Okay. So if it is a ordinary course of business, then easily you can buy the product without any hesitations or confusions. At that time, this rule is not applicable. Next, the buyer must act in good faith. Yes, if the buyer is believing that you are selling the right product and if you are not fooling that person, yes, obviously is going to purchase. So the buyer must act in good faith. Next, the buyer should not have at the time of contract notice that seller had no authority to sell. Yes, the buyer should not have at the right time to contract notice that seller had no authority to sell. So if the buyer or if the seller, okay, if the seller of the goods or the person who is purchasing the goods, the buyer, if that person have the authority or any document that the seller can't sell it again to someone else, then easily can purchase those goods. In these situations, this rule is not applicable. Moving further again, the rule number 3, that is sale by a joint owner. Yes, sale by a joint owner, that is co-owner. So one property there will be two owners. Sometimes for one property there will be two owners. So if there are two owners, they are called co-owners. Okay. Rule number 28, that is section 28. In order to get a valid title to the buyer who buys the goods from one of co-owners, the following conditions should be satisfied. That means in order to get a valid title to the buyer who buys the goods, one of the co-owner satisfy the following conditions. So here, first condition is the co-owner must be in the sole possession of the goods with the consent of the other co-owner. For example, there are two owners. So one owner, what will do? Just he'll tell the another owner, the co-owner, that you be the sole owner of the property. I will not disturb and you can sell it to anyone. If that consent is given by the co-owner, then this rule is again not applicable. So if there are two owners, one owner will be giving the consent to the another co-owner by stating that he will not interrupt at the time of sale. Next, the buyer should purchase the goods for consideration and in good faith. Yes, if the buyer is purchasing the goods for some consideration and with the good faith of the co-owners or the joint owners property, then again this rule is not applicable. The buyer should not have notice or suspicion at the time of sale of any defect in seller's authority to sell. Yes, the buyer should not find any kind of notice. He should not find any kind of notice at the time of sale. See, if the buyer have not find any kind of notice at the time of purchasing or buying the particular goods of the property, so he can easily purchase those properties from the co-owner of the property. Next one, fourth one, sale by person in possession under voidable contract. Person in possession under voidable contract, section 29. So what this section 29 says? When the seller of the goods has obtained possession of the goods under a voidable contract and he sells those goods before the contract is repudiated, the buyer of such goods acquired a good title provided the buyers act in the good faith and without notice of the seller's defect of title. So here, at the time of when the goods is sold by a person in possession under voidable contract. If a person is in the possession of the goods under the voidable contract. So what is this voidable contract? So it is a valid contract, but because of some default, it is going to be a voidable contract. That means two parties came into a contract, but one party failed to fulfill the conditions of the contract, then it become voidable contract. So at that time, the seller can sell the product to the another party. So another party will not be having any right to question that seller. That's what section 29 says. Next, sale by seller in possession after sale. Sale by seller in possession after sale. Section 30, subsection 1. So here, where a person having sold the goods continues to be in possession of the goods or of the documents of title and sells them over again to a buyer, the buyer gets a better title provided he has acted in good faith and without notice of the previous sale. So here what happens? Sale by seller in possession after sale. So again, what here the seller will do? The seller having sold the goods continues to be the possession of the goods or the documents of the title. So here the seller will be having, after the sales also the seller will be having the possession of the goods as well as he will be having the documents relating to the goods so that he can sell it to the buyer and buyer can buy it without any hesitation or without any confusions, and he should buy the product with good faith, the goods or the property with the good faith and without noticing of the previous sale. So whatever happened in the previous sale, due to something, that sale was cancelled. Okay, that sale was cancelled between the parties, but yet the ownership and the property or the goods is in the possession of the actual owner of the property, so that easily you can purchase it. Okay, easily you can purchase it. You need not to hesitate to purchase that goods or property. So while you're purchasing the goods, if the owner is in the possession, if the seller is in the possession and documents are with him, easily we can purchase by assuming that it is not got sold to someone else. So in these situations, we can sell the product even though we are non-owners of the product. So in these situations, again, this rule, that is the rule of nemo dot quod non habet, this rule is not applicable in these scenarios. And also, sale by buyer in possession after sale. Yes, sale by buyer in possession after sale. Section 30 subsection 2. Where by the buyer has bought or agreed to buy the goods with the consent of the owner, obtains possession of the goods or documents of that to the goods, but the seller still has some line or right over the goods. If the buyer sell the goods to a second buyer who buys them in good faith, the second buyer gets a better title. That means you purchased, okay, from seller as a buyer, you purchase the product and the ownership is with you and the goods are in your possession. You can sell it to the next party. So if next party is having good faith in you, then obviously you can purchase that product, and that is will also be considered as sale of goods, and no confusions will happen in that scenario. Sale by unpaid seller. Sale by unpaid seller, section 54 subsection 3. Where an unpaid seller was in possession of the goods after having exercised the right of line or stoppage in the transit resale of the goods, the buyer gets a good title there too as against the original buyer. The sale of unpaid seller. Sometimes if some people fails to pay the EMI, what bank will do? The financial institutions, whatever the products the buyer purchased, what they'll do, they take back that product, they seize that product and they resell it. Okay, at that time also as a buyer you'll get a good title, and the person was actually purchased and failed to pay the EMI, he will not come and he will not question you because he didn't pay the EMI, he didn't pay the full amount. So what the seller did, seller have the possession of the goods and he resell it to the someone else or to the third party. At that time also he is not the actual owner, but because of some misunderstanding between the seller and the buyer, and because of failure of the buyer in paying the EMI, this particular person acquired the ownership, possessed the ownership of the product as well as the ownership, and the goods is with him, he can sell it to the another party. Next, performance of the sale of contract. A contract of sale. A contract of sale consists of two reciprocal promises. The contract of sale consists of two reciprocal promises. The seller's duty to deliver the goods. The seller duty is to deliver the goods, and the buyer's duty to accept the goods and pay the price. Yes. So here performance of the sale of contract. So when this performance will happen, when the two duties are performed, then the sale of contract will happen between the parties. So two duties are most important. Which are those two duties? Those two duties are the seller duty to deliver the goods. The seller's duty is to deliver the goods, and the buyer's duty to accept the goods and pay the price. If the seller is delivering the goods and if the buyer is accepting the goods and paying the price, yes, then we can call it as the sale of contract. It may be noted that the delivery of goods and the payment, the delivery of the goods and the payment of their price are the concurrent conditions. For example, both these conditions should be performed simultaneously. Yes, here both the conditions, that is delivery of goods, paying of price for the goods, both the conditions should be performed simultaneously. So at that time only we can call it as the performance of the sale of contract. That is the sale of goods by the seller to the buyer. So with this, I'm going to wind up this session. I'm going to come up with few more new topics in the upcoming session. Until then, thank you all. Have a nice day. Namaste.